All right, so in an extremely rare case, I'm going to generate content that's actually time relevant to something that's going on right now. So this is something that seems to be moving through the social media sphere, and it has to do with the lats and range of motion and training them. Now, I don't know who started this. I believe it was Chris Beardsley who wrote an article that I will be discussing in a moment that I think has then gotten picked up by a couple of others. I know the guys at N1 Education, and don't worry, Sam, I will be getting to your email. I'm not dodging you. Has jumped on this, and then somebody called Lift Run Bang that I've never heard of has as well. And if you want some true entertainment, go to Mike Israel's Instagram page at RPD Mike Israel, I think. He and the Lift Run Bang guys are having debate, discussion about this, and it's a level of discourse of two 12-year-olds. The Lift Run Bang guys told Mike to tread lightly, son, in all caps, because, you know, that's argument. Maybe this will end up in a boxing match, because apparently that's how we settle disagreements on the internet now. Anyway, so here's what's at issue. Is it has to do with, again, the lat involvement during, I guess, certain different exercises and certain movements. And there's only one at issue here, right? Like, the shoulder is super complicated, right? It can move in so many different frickin' directions, but we're only concerned with one, and that is flexion and extension. All right, so from this position, arms to the side, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, right? Flexion, extension. We're not concerned with AB and adduction. We're not concerned with AB and adduction in what's called the scapular plane. Flexion and extension. Okay, so since it will come up the way this is defined, this is 0 degrees, essentially, 90, 180, mostly. Like, I can't quite, like, I have to kind of fight it, right? 0, I don't know, whatever, 30, 45, 90. It's about 120, and this will come up, and then 180. So the assertion is that the lats have no leverage once you get into 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, which again is about here, and I'm eyeballing it. So any of you pedants who want to break out the goniometer and the protractor can just shut the fuck up. It's about there. And the issue being that if the assertion that the lats have no lever arm means they have no pull in that movement, which means that any lat movement where the arm is at 120 degrees or higher, it's not a lat movement. I believe the N1 guys have been focused on the pullover. Whether it's, I don't know if it's dumbbell pullover or the cable pullover. The dumbbell pullover is a fucking stupid movement to begin with, but that's a whole separate thing. Cable pullovers, pullover machine are a whole separate thing. Right. But I guess basically they're going, you know, well, if the lats stop working here, pull downs are bad. This is bad. Okay. So that's the topic, is the assertion that the lats have no leverage with the shoulder above 120 degrees of flexion, which again, like I said, you know, pull downs start there, whether it's an under grip, over grip, wide grip, you know, cable pullover starts about there. So, is this true? But more importantly, what does the data say? So first let me let's briefly talk about lat anatomy. The lat is not, well, it's a single muscle, but it's got 3 different segments that run kind of differently. And I've put up an image that hopefully is not copyrighted, right? There's a lower lat that's sort of like, imagine that we're looking at your back, right? There's a lower lat that sort of runs fairly vertically fibers. Beardsley calls this the inferior portion. There's kind of a middle lat. It's a little bit more angled. This is the thoracic portion. And then there's a very upper bit, which Beardsley calls, I believe, the cervical portion. So you can see that even though it's a singular muscle, there are fibers that run in sort of slightly different directions. At the very lowest part near the hip, they run a little bit more vertically, become more horizontal, and sort of as it goes up. So that's what we're talking about here. Inferior, medial, and superior lats. Chris Beardsley uses slightly different nomenclature, but it's the same thing. All right, I guess this will make sense. I should give you like a brief section on the biomechanics of what we're talking about. And what you're going to hear come up a lot is moment arm, or I might say lever arm, but they're the same thing. All right, remember back to high school physics. And the moment or the lever arm is defined as the perpendicular distance between a force and an axis of rotation. Now, here's an easy way to think of this, and I'll show you an image. Imagine that you're putting a bolt on something, right? You've got your wrench, a very short wrench, short lever arm, right? The perpendicular distance to the bolt. You're going to be screwing this way, force is down, versus a long wrench. Shorter lever arms mean that the effective force is smaller. And longer lever arms mean that the effective force is higher, right? This is that old thing about, with a lever long enough, I can move the world, right? Again, it's why putting a bolt on with a longer wrench is easier. With the same downward force of your hand, a longer lever arm means more resultant force. All right, here's a schematic example of a bicep curl. All right, the little light blue circle, that's a dumbbell that you're holding in your hand. The horizontal line is the forearm, right? This is the 90-degree part of the curl. The vertical line is the upper arm, the humerus, the other funny bone. And then the red line is the biceps, which attaches closer to the elbow. All right, now, gravity always points down, so the force is perpendicular for the weight. And you can see M sub F, that's the lever arm, the moment arm, between the force perpendicular to the axis of rotation, which is the elbow. All right, so that red line is the biceps, right? And it's pulling up, which means if you want to get into vector math, we've got a vertical component and a horizontal component, and not getting into all of that because it's not necessary for this discussion. You can see that it's much closer to the elbow, which means that its moment arm, M sub B, is much, much, much shorter than the moment arm created by the weight at the elbow. Its effective force will be reduced. Relatively, again, shorter lever arm. In most cases in the human body, the lever arm of the muscle is shorter than the lever arm of the resistance. There are exceptions. The calves are one, and one of the chewing muscles is one. If you get bored, go look into first, second, and third degree levers. Shit I can never remember because it's in books. Anyway, this kind of shows you what we're talking about. Now, again, as the lever arm gets shorter, the effective force a muscle or a weight can generate becomes much smaller. And this is a big part of why like individual biomechanics can really drastically affect how much weight can be moved, right? Let's say you've got two people whose biceps are identically strong. They can generate the same amount of force, they insert at the same place on the forearm. But one of them has much shorter forearms than the other. The individual with a longer forearm will lift a lighter weight dumbbell because that lighter weight will generate, or has a higher moment arm because their forearms are longer. So here's a super rough schematic from an article I did several years ago about muscular tension. All right, so it is comparing two individuals doing a bicep curl. The top individual has a longer forearm compared to the bottom individual. That's why the number 10 is in different places, right? So the top guy's holding a 10-pound weight or 10-kilogram weight. And because his forearm is longer, he may need to generate 20 units of force in his biceps to lift that. The lower image, the individual with a shorter forearm, to lift that same 10-unit weight may only require 15 units of bicep force. Now the numbers are made up, it's just to illustrate a point. So when you have people with shorter femurs in the squat, where the weight is closer to the knee and the hip, those lever arms are shorter, for any given amount of force, they can lift more weight. It's also why powerlifters will frequently alter their biomechanics to try to adjust the lever arms so that for the same amount of force, they can lift a heavier weight. Does that make sense? I certainly hope it does. And this is actually why people can lift the world on a hip thrust, right? So the hip thrust, the axis of rotation is the hip. The weight is typically, right in the crease of the hip. It's however far away it is. So the lever arm tends to be very, very short. If you were able somehow to move the weight out to mid-thigh so that it had that whole lever arm, a much smaller weight on the bar would require a higher force from the glutes because the lever arm of the force resistance is longer. Does that make sense? Certainly hope it does. The point of all of this being, and this will bring me into Chris's article, is if at any point you have a zero lever arm, any force you generate will have zero effect, right? So again, imagine that bolt, which has a center of rotation is right there. You could put your fingertips right here and try to spin it, and you would basically get nowhere. There's a microscopic lever arm. If you grabbed it around here, a little bit longer lever arm, you get a little more force. Get a wrench, get a longer wrench, get a giant wrench. The longer the wrench, the easier it gets. The lever arm goes to zero, or effectively zero. No force can be generated. No effective force can be generated to cause movement. All right, let's look at Chris Beardsley's article. So first, let's look at Chris Beardsley's article, and I've included the link if you want to go read it. It is in depth, which is me being what it is turgid and complicated. Now, I like Chris in general. I think he relies a little bit too much on animal research and untrained, which is neither here nor there. He's said all along that muscular tension is the primary driver on growth, which he's even got a little ebook on it. And I've been saying that since 1995, and that's because it is. So my point of this being that, like, I don't hate the guy. I don't detest everything. I agree with him more often than not. So don't think it's just like another of Lyle's vendettas. What I want to do is look at part of his article. It's super involved, like everything he writes. And go read it if you want. I'm not going to try to address. I'm just going to address the one bit that has to do with just the biomechanics of what's going on, where the claim comes from, and whether or not it is or isn't valid. So let's get to it. So this is the key section of his article when he's talking about shoulder extension. He says, effects of joint angle on the whole latissimus dorsi. Taking all three regions together, the shoulder extensor moment arm of the latissimus dorsi changes with shoulder elevation angle, although its curve is quite flat. At low degrees of shoulder elevation, the arms by the sides, the shoulder extensor moment arm length is quite short. A broad peak is reached at 45 degrees of shoulder elevation, and then as the shoulder is elevated beyond 60 degrees, the shoulder extensor moment arm decreases linearly. Surprisingly, the latissimus dorsi has no leverage at all for shoulder extension once the arm is elevated beyond 120 degrees. So that's really where this whole thing is coming from, like that one statement, based on the paper he cites, which I'm going to get into shortly. Now, the paper in question did look at the three different portions of the lats. The superior, the very upper, the very, Jesus Christ, the very upper bit, the medial lats, the middle bit, and then the inferior lats. Although, again, he uses different terms. He writes, effective joint angle on latissimus dorsi regions. Looking at each region of latissimus dorsi separately provides a different picture. Firstly, it is clear that the superior thoracic region contributes to shoulder extension to a far greater extent than the middle lumbar and inferior pelvic regions, at least until the arms are elevated beyond 90 degrees, arms at shoulder height. Secondly, the regions peak at different joint angles. The middle lumbar region peaks at 30 degrees, the superior thoracic region peaks at 45 degrees, and the inferior pelvic region peaks at 60 degrees of shoulder elevation. Thirdly, the middle lumbar region ceases to have any moment arm at 90 degrees of shoulder elevation, and the superior thoracic region ceases to have any moment arm at 120 degrees of shoulder elevation. However, the inferior pelvic region maintains a small moment arm that extends to more flexed joint angles. Now, if I'm being a pedantic nit, and let's face it, I always am, the final sentence of those two paragraphs slightly contradict one another. The first one says that averaged as a whole, the lats have no lever arm, and the second paragraph says, well, the inferior portion has a small lever arm. Like I said, that's pedantic nitpickery even for me, but I thought it's worth noting. Especially worth noting since some of the people that are reading this are speaking in absolute terms, that the lats have no moment arm above 120 degrees. Maybe averaged as a whole based on this reference, again, that I'm going to get to, it doesn't. But obviously part of the lat still does. Nuance is lost in trite Instagram bullshit. Chris does get into the details, arguably more than I do. But this is an important distinction. Maybe the lats as a whole don't. Maybe they do. Going to get to it. However, even the inferior lats have a small moment arm. All right, moving on. He finishes that section by saying, practical implications. In practice, only the inferior pelvic region of latissimus dorsi has a shoulder extension moment arm above 120 degrees of elevation. Even so, at low levels of shoulder elevation, the superior thoracic region has the longest moment arm length. The latissimus dorsi shoulder extension moment, arm lengths of all regions peak between 30 and 60 degrees. Thus, it seems likely that shoulder extension exercises that involve peak force between 30 to 60 degrees of shoulder elevation will target the superior thoracic region of latissimus dorsi, while exercises that involve peak force above 120 degrees will be somewhat effective for the inferior pelvic region. Okay, so I know that's pretty dense. Like I said, this is kind of how Chris writes, and it can be tough to get through. Rather than try to explain all that, I'm just going to jump to his conclusions. Now, again, in his article, he looks at a ton of other stuff. He's looking at sarcomere length and just a whole recovery and a whole ton of other stuff. Go read the article. I'm not trying. It would take me hours to go through all of it. All right, first, let's look at what he wrote, and then conclusions were based on this explanation. He wrote. Shoulder extension exercises that involve peak force between 30 to 60 degrees of shoulder elevation, such as close grip rows with accommodating resistance, can be used to target the superior or thoracic region of the lats. In contrast, shoulder extension exercises that involve peak force at high levels of shoulder elevation, such as a machine pullover, will target the inferior or pelvic region. Finally, shoulder adduction exercises involving peak force at 65 to 75 degrees of shoulder elevation, wide grip pull down with accommodating resistance, will target the middle, lumbar, and inferior pelvic regions. All right, so he writes, shoulder extension exercises involve peak force between 30 to 60 degrees of shoulder elevation, can be used to target the superior thoracic region. And he gives an example of this, a close grip row with accommodating resistance, right? So, all right, so close grip row, right? You're seated here, right? V handle, shoulders are probably starting, might be a little bit higher, about, 60 degrees, pulling, row. Right? Now, your shoulders are ending up actually in hyperextension, but we're starting about here, force, 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 force. It's also a mid-back exercise. Retract your scapula, but we're not talking about mid-back. But that's what he's talking about in that first section of that paragraph. All right, in contrast, shoulder extension exercises that involve peak force at high levels of shoulder elevation, such as a machine pullover, will target the inferior pelvic region. All right, so that's, right, all machine pullover, if you've ever seen one, pads go here, and you're bringing it to this position, right? Lots of force here because of the way it works, although with a cam, it's pretty consistent through to here. Which is interesting because from what I can tell, the N1 guys are saying that pullovers are shitty movement, so maybe they need to be arguing with Chris. Finally, shoulder adduction exercises. Now I skipped the bit on adduction, right? This is adduction of the shoulder. This is with the elbows out, abduction, adduction, and I skipped the section where he discussed that. Shoulder adduction exercises involving peak force at 65 to 7 degrees of shoulder elevation, which is somewhere between here and here. Right, 90, 45, 65 to 75, somewhere in that range. Wide grip pull down with accommodating resistance will target the middle, lumbar, and inferior pelvic regions. All right, so what he's saying is that the best way to train the lats for hypertrophy is to do a medium grip row, a overhand grip. He says wide. I don't think it really matters because this doesn't really change the movement of the upper arm. Neither here nor there. Pure adduction, and then a pullover movement. And I'm sorry, but that's a lot of verbiage to reinvent the wheel. My back workout for years was I would do a narrow grip cable row. And I wrote an article about this 12 years ago, talking about why that was such an effective lat and mid-back exercise and brachialis, and do an undergrip if you want to get some more biceps. A pull-down movement in adduction, which we could have known from fundamental mechanics, is, it's the other primary function of the lats, is adduction and shoulder extension, a little internal rotation. And then a pullover, which gets the stretch position. So it's a lot of verbiage. And yes, I realize we do pull downs in different positions. We do here, we do medium overhand grip. Even an elbows high row is not for lats anyway, that's for mid back. So we don't have to worry about that one. But I don't know that this says anything particularly different or even interesting. However, that was never the issue, not Chris's conclusions. It was the assertion that above 120 degrees of shoulder extension, the lats play no role. Sorry, 120 degrees of shoulder flexion, the lats play no role in extension, which A, Chris says is not true. The inferior section has a small lever arm. Regardless, that's the assertion, the non-nuanced assertion moving through social media. And now let's look at the science of where it came from and whether or not it actually holds completely true. Or rather, what the potential limitations of that science are. Okay, so the paper Chris links to is by Freya Hick and David C. Ackland. It's titled The Moment Arms of the Muscles Spanning the Glenohumeral Joint, a Systematic Review. So the glenohumeral joint is where the humerus, the other funny bone, inserts into the head of the humerus, inserts into the glenoid fossa, which is sort of this open bit of the shoulder. Glenoid fossa, humeral, glenohumeral joint. It's basically the shoulder joint in isolation that we're looking at here. And it was published in the Journal of Anatomy in 2019, which must be why it's just now coming up. This is a relatively recent thing. So they did a review paper. The goal being, the objective of this study was to undertake a systematic review of the moment arms of the major muscles spanning the glenohumeral joint during abduction, flexion, and axial rotation. Moment arm data for the deltoid, pectoralis major, latissimus, teres major, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, subscapularis, and teres minor reported when measured using the geometric and tendon excursion methods. So like most systematic analysis, they looked at a ton of papers. In this case, they first identified 34,805 titles, which reduced to 25,280 after removal of duplicates. And after they applied their exclusion criteria and everything else, they ended up with 20 total articles. And again, this is typical of systematic analyses. You always see, like, we found 8 billion papers, and 7 of which actually met our criteria. So I'm not criticizing that. I just always find it amusing. So anyway, studies that looked at different muscles using one of 2 techniques to determine moment arms. And as it turns out, there were only 2 that were relevant that looked at the lats. All right, so here's the data on the different muscles in shoulder flexion. And I go from showing the whole thing to zooming in on the only bit that matters, which is Latissimus dorsi, in which you'll see 2 lines, one light gray and one darker black. So I'm super impressed that my Ken Burns effect worked. In any case, this is the key bit, the data on Latissimus dorsi. Focusing first on that dark black line. What you can see is it's showing the lever arm of the lats as a whole, starting at 15 degrees of extension, going up to 120. This is what Chris described in that first paragraph, and you can see that the lever arm in millimeters does in fact drop to essentially 0 at 120 degrees. This is where that claim is coming from, although recall that it was segment specific. But this is where this comes from. Also notice that that lighter line in the same picture, but I'll come back to that. So in his article, Chris links to the Hick review that I just showed you the data from. But as usual, after I read this, I'm like, now I want to go read the original papers just to see what they said, what they did. I especially want to do this because there's 2 lines on that chart, one of which seems to be being ignored. Now, I'm not saying that second line is the writer data. I'm simply saying that if there are 2 data sets, one of which is being ignored, well, maybe we should take a look at both. So first, let's look at the paper showing that the lever arm does in fact fall to 0. So the original data that was presented in the Hick review comes from a paper by David C. Ackland, Ponteren Pack, Martin Richardson, and Marcus G. Pandy. Moment arms of the muscles crossing the anatomical shoulder, Journal of Anatomy, 2008. So the purpose of this paper, as stated, was the objective of the present study was to determine the instantaneous moment arms of 18 major muscle subregion crossing the glenohumeral joint during coronal plane abduction and sagittal plane flexion. And again, we're mainly focused with sagittal plane flexion. Now, they use something called the tendon excursion method, which is one method of doing this, right? I tried to look into it. I am not going to try to get too deep into what that is because I would garble it. It seems to be a commonly used procedure, so I'm going to assume that it has been validated. It seems to have been. There's also a geometric method, but this is what it used. And essentially it's looking, they're looking at actual cadaver models and how much the tendon excursion, how much it's lengthening throughout that range of motion, and then doing a bunch of math, which again, I'm not even beginning to try to explain because I couldn't do it if I wanted to. But I'm not just going to go, the method sucks. As far as I can tell, this is standard methodology. Good enough. So the study actually got cadaver bits from men who were on average 87 years old, which really reminds me of anatomy class and playing in the cadaver lab, and it made me vegetarian for 6 months, but it's pretty icky. But they actually got cadavers, and there's a picture in this picture, in this paper, and it looks like something out of a zombie movie. It's a removed, bloody, gory shoulder. All right, so they took this cadaver stump, which had, the delts, the arm, bunch of the shoulder muscles, rotator cuff, latissimus dorsi, and pec bits. So it's really hard to see those in the image, which I'm not going to put in this video. They state that the skin and subcutaneous tissues were removed. For the purposes of the study, a muscle subregion was defined as a bundle of muscle fibers with a distinct and separate bony origin or insertion, from which the bundle could be detached and stripped from the rest of the muscle. Muscles were identified and divided into subregions, blah, blah, blah. In the case of latissimus dorsi and pectoralis major, in which there were no defined bony origins, subregions were identified with the aid of an anatomical atlas, and they cite Spoutholz Spanner 1967. Right, so there was no clavicle for the pec to, or sort of sternum or clavicle for the pec to attach to. There was no rib cage or pelvis or spine for the lats to attach to. So they had to estimate where the way the muscle was pulling as far as the subregion, and they did that from a 50-year-old atlas. And I'm not saying it's wrong, but I will come back to this point because it does factor into this. And they basically mounted it to this big metal thing that was supposed to mimic the scapula, and then set up a bunch of pulleys and nylon wires through the muscle, tied to sutures attached to the pec major, latissimus, and teres major. It's gross. I'm not going to read it to you. If you go look at this picture or this paper, just be forewarned. There's a picture of an arm stump. I'm going to assume that this method is valid enough. Okay, then they did the measurements, which basically involved moving the arm a couple different ways, which again, I'm not going to try to describe. It'll be easier to just jump to the discussion, the limitations that they talk about. And then they moved it through different ranges of motion, here, and I believe in the scapular plane, and did all their math and determined the lever arms. And here's what they showed. So all you need to focus on here are the gray lines, which are showing flexion. And you can see it's exactly what Chris described, right? The inferior lat dorsi, which is the thin gray line, starts low, comes up, still stays a little bit positive at 120 degrees. The other two hit peaks. One of them is at 40, one of them is a little bit earlier than that, and then fall off to effectively 0 at 120. So it's exactly what Chris said. In this study, 2 of the lats fell off to 0 at 120 degrees, and the inferior portion maintained a small lever arm. And it was actually, to give the exact numbers, the minimum lever arms for superior lat dorsi were negative 0.1 millimeter. Negative just means that it has an extension function. Middle lat dorsi, negative 0.7. And then inferior lat dorsi, negative 2.9. And this is compared to values in like the 10s and 20s at other places. So these are very small, approaching 0, except in the case of the inferior latissimus dorsi. Quite honestly, you could have almost predicted this without even needing the data, right? Because this is how most muscles work, right? So look at the biceps, right? Here's my elbow. Here's the bicep pull. The lever arm is tiny, because of course it is. As the arm bends, it lengthens, and it tends to be the longest in the middle position, which is also conveniently where the biceps is at the best force length tension relationship for the muscle, and then it shrinks again. This is why when you do a curl, It's kind of, of course, the lever arm of the weight is also changing. It's lowest here, it's longest here, and it's light again. So, right, it starts easy, hard, because this lever arm is longest here, even though this lever arm is also longest, and then falls off again. Like basic biomechanics would have predicted a small lever arm in this position, right? So like here's the lats, right? They're kind of coming up into oh, good Lord. You know, they sort of attach here to the humerus, right? When your arm's down by your sides, like the lever arm's pretty short and it's going to go up and increase. But as the upper arm goes to vertical, of course the lever arm's tiny, right? Because the lats are inserting into here, and if the axis of rotation is back, God, I'm bad at this, is my nose, for example, of course it's going to be shorter. And by the same token, like we know that the pecs are a weak shoulder extensor, especially in that position. And of course there are other muscles that are involved in this, which is sort of the claim being made. Is like, the lats have no lever arm, so it becomes pec and other muscle dominant. We know those muscles are involved, and we have forever. I mean, the pullover used to be pushed as a pec exercise. And so but that's not the issue. The issue is the claim that there is no leverage from the lats. So let's keep going. This study was simply about magnitudes and showing just how low it seems to have gotten at those higher shoulder flexion positions. But again, we could have predicted this fundamentally. All right, so again, the data seems to be pretty clear-cut. Like I said, it's not quite what's being stated in social media, which is the lats have no function above 120. It's essentially negligible at 0.1 for one portion. It's small at 0.7 for another, and it's still 2.7, still very small for the inferior portion. So it's not none. Like I said, Chris presented it in a much more nuanced way, which you can do when you use 80,000 words, than most other people are not. All right, and essentially discussion, like I said, they looked at a bunch of other movements. Same conclusions. However, it's always worth considering some of the details. Like I said, as far as I can tell, the methodology is pretty standard. So I want to address that. Here's what they even said. The potential limitation of the present study may be in the ability to control and eliminate humeral internal and external rotation and glenohumeral joint translation during the tendon excursion experiments. Now, I want to explain what those are because this is important. They measured it with the hands in basically a neutral position, right? External rotation, internal rotation. You know, this is affecting the position of the humerus relative to the body, and in as much as the lats attach to the humerus, that's affecting what the lats are potentially doing. But this is important. The study was not measuring, say, is there a difference when you are doing an undergrip pull down with internally rotated hands? What happens if you're externally rotated like a medium overgrip? Even in a dumbbell pullover, which again I think is a shitty movement, your hands are not in neutral. They are rotated. That could be affecting things. I'm not saying they do or they don't. I'm saying that this study could not include that because of the way it was done. And in real-world movements, there is more than just this. Glenohumeral translation is going to be hard to explain, so I'm just going to go to the internet and read a description. Glenohumeral, right, so remember the glenohumeral joint is the humerus, the head of the humerus fits inside the glenoid fossa, which is very open. That's why the shoulder is so mobile. Glenohumeral translation is movement of the center of the humeral head with respect to the face of the glenoid. Glenohumeral translation laxity is a translation observed on examination of the joint. Substantial amount of laxity is characteristic of normal glenohumeral joints. What this is saying is that joint, the way that head fits in, right, it's not like a leg extension pivot, right, where it can pivot and that's it, right, like it's just on a bolt. When the humerus moves during different movements, it can shift around its position and slide around a little bit, which changes the relationships of muscle lengths, of axes of rotation, of all these other factors that occur in real human movement, that occur in different exercises that were not or could not be included in this study. Again, I'm not dismissing the results. I'm just simply saying that they need to be considered within the limitations of the study versus what actually happens in the real world. They write, glenohumeral joint manipulation, again, the glenohumeral joint, was essentially a manual process that involved human error. In particular, the definition of the joint center of rotation was approximated. Now that's important too, because the lever arm is being measured from the pull of the tendon to the center of rotation. Without measuring that directly, this is a calculation that has a potential source of error. There's also the fact that the center of rotation can change slightly as a joint moves. I'm not saying it does or it doesn't. I'm saying this is a variable that this can account for. They're estimating the center of rotation a certain way in a certain place. That could affect the magnitude. Center of rotation is further from the tendon than they approximated. The lever arms would still be larger. Now, they still might not be large, right? I'm not saying it's going to go from 0.7 to 15, but they might not be 0, which means that the assertion that the lats have no leverage above 120 might not be valid. Not saying it is or it isn't. Just saying that when you estimate center of rotation, and that's part of your major calculation for the lever arm, if you misestimate that, your results are not going to be correct in an absolute number kind of sense. Let me note in this regard that as part of the experimental protocol, they state lines of action were determined using a computational model as described elsewhere due to the difficulty in accurately measuring three-dimensional muscle fiber directions in vitro. So we have multiple calculations and estimations of the actual line of pull of the muscle and of the center of rotation. And if those calculations are off, then the calculated lever arms will also be off. Again, not saying they are or they aren't. I'm saying that we need to maybe consider the results of this study within what was actually done, rather than what people read in the abstract or from the review paper. This is a limitation they mentioned that social media seems to be ignoring because this is nuance. Chris didn't even mention this. A further limitation with the lines of action of the pec major and latissimus dorsi were based on the anatomy of the visual human male as represented in the model of Garner and Pandy 2001. Were not representative specimen-specific anatomy, which means that while these data may hold in average given the other limitations, they might not hold for any given individual. This adds to the fact that, like I said, they were estimating lines of pull from a different anatomical atlas. And just as a point, anyone who's been in cadaver lab and seen the state of the cadavers, the muscles are severely atrophied. Like I said, it's gross. I spent 2 quarters in there at UCLA, and it's possible that those aren't representative of an adult human male. If that muscle is severely atrophied, it can change the line of pull. And trust me, we sat and tugged on muscles and tendons, and it's gross and it's icky, but it shows you exactly what happens with age-related atrophy. It's worth considering that studying 87-year-old men might not represent a 23-year-old male. Not saying it does or it doesn't. It's just something else worth considering. Differences in attachments of a muscle do occur and can affect leverages. So for any given, like they were again, it was another estimate of drawing the lines of the average lines to do these calculations. So we've just got estimate upon estimate upon estimate, not throwing out the data. These are limitations that need to be considered before we decide the lats don't function over 120 degrees of extension, because this study doesn't say that, except within exactly what it did, none of which is being discussed by anybody but me. In addition, moment arms of the anterior deltoid may be subject to error. That's not relevant here. So there were several limitations to the conclusions of this study. Was it good data? Sure. Was it very thorough? Sure. But there were factors that occur in real-world exercise that were not taken into account here. What's going on internal-external rotation? This is a factor during different exercises. What if I'm doing, here's a medium grip row. What changes if I go to an under grip row? It is changing the relationship of my humerus to my torso. Could be impacting the lats. The estimated center of rotation. Center of rotation is what determines the moment arm. They were estimating the lines of pull of the muscle from a different place. They were estimating from a different source, again, based on a model that might not represent individual specifics. These are estimates upon estimates upon estimates to do the calculations. Not saying the data is wrong. I'm just saying that maybe these are nuances that should be considered before we speak in absolutes. I haven't seen anybody talk about this. Chris didn't talk about this because he seems to have relied solely on the review paper. I could be wrong, again, but he didn't mention it. At least I didn't see it. These are factors to consider. But there's another factor. And for that, I want to go briefly back to the image from the Hick and Ackland review paper, because I feel that something is being ignored or not mentioned by anybody, including Chris. Now, I realize that I'm old and my eyes are going, but looking at this image from the Hick paper, I see two lines showing the moment arm of the Latissimus dorsi. Now, the top one from the Ackland paper absolutely shows that the lever arm goes to 0 at 120 degrees. But there's a second line, which is much, much higher in terms of the lever arm. In fact, it's 4 to 5 times as high, up at 30 to 40 millimeters versus 7 to 15. Well, where'd that come from? So if you remember, when I introduced the Hick review paper, there were two papers that addressed the impact or the function of the lat in shoulder flexion. Ackland was one that showed it goes to 0, and that's the one everybody's fixating on. But what about the other one? Now, this was a paper done by David K. Kuechle, Kuechle, and a bunch of others, titled Shoulder Muscle Moment Arms During Horizontal Flexion and Elevation, printed in the Journal of Shoulder and Elbow Surgery in October of 1997. So it's a much older paper, but Hick included it, so the data must be worth considering. So to a great degree, this paper was nearly identical. They used 12 fresh frozen cadaveric forecarter, so basically arm chunks, shoulder and a delt and a lat and an arm, and they used the same tendon excursion technique, and they mounted it to a thing and ran a bunch of strings through it, and basically took it through the same sort of movements as far as it went. So for the most part, it was basically the same. During elevation, the scapula was fixed vertically at 0 degrees of inclination. Humeral rotation was kept constant to the convention previously used in this laboratory, which I would have to go look up. Like I said, basically the same, with one big exception that I need to mention because it's important. They did not subdivide the lats into 3 different segments. They set up one lever arm measurement from wherever they put the string or the wire or whatever it was. And as I'll come back to, they basically picked the midpoint of the lat as the singular line that they wanted to look at in terms of calculating moment arm. And that is an important limitation of this study, but outside of that, very important issue. Essentially the same thing. There is also one other big difference that I think is why people are leaving this out of the discussion, which is that they only measured to 80 degrees of shoulder flexion, right? So they only went from shoulder down to about here, just below 90. They did not go up to 120, and you can see that on the Hick data. That's important, and it's worth considering, but I still want to look at the data because, again, Hick did. So let's look at their results first. So again, a little tough to see in this. What you were looking at, you want the second line from the top, right? The solid black line directly underneath the dotted line. And that shows the moment arm of the lats from 0 to 80 degrees. And what you see is it starts at, like 2.7 centimeters, 27 millimeters, scoops up to about 4 centimeters, 40 millimeters at about 40 degrees, and then comes back down to about 3.2 centimeters, 32 millimeters at 80 degrees. Now this is important, and you can even see that in the original Hick image, is that this paper found moment arms that were like 4 times larger. Right, so look at these differences, right? So the Ackland paper is at the top, but say at 45 degrees, Ackland showed a lever arm of, roughly 13 millimeters, and Hick was up at 40. So 3 times the magnitude. That's pretty significant. It's worth considering. Now, unfortunately, we don't know what would have happened past 80 degrees. it seems unlikely that it would have dropped to zero, right? The lines show almost identical slopes and curves. So if we kind of eyeball that to 120, you'd expect it to end up at, what, maybe 24, 25, 26, somewhere in that range. The point is that regardless of the absolute value, it would have been significantly higher than in the Ackland paper, and it sure as shit most likely would not have been zero. Now, I'm not saying this is the correct study because it says everybody else is wrong. I think it's worth looking at. But now we need to look at why. Why the different results? Why is this showing such significantly different lever arms? The authors write, a potential criticism of this study lies in our attempt to represent the centroid of muscles with broad origins. By that they mean the lats are huge, right? The lats are huge. They basically said the lever arm starts at the center and goes up to the humerus. Continuing, this assumes the actual line of force bisects the origin of the muscle and further that the muscle contracts uniformly. Neither assumption is likely to be entirely true. However, modeling multiple fibers for each muscle would make this study overly complex. A line directed parallel to a muscle's fibers bisecting its origin seems most likely to represent the resultant of the force vector generated by the muscle. Right, so picture the lats, right? Here's like the lower section, here's kind of the middle section, then here's the upper section. What they're saying, like, you know, we drew like the line of force, the line of force, the line of force. What they're saying is that, like, by taking the halfway point, you're going to see the lever arm of the resultant vector, but obviously that's not going to tell you what's going on in the individual segment. And if you go back to the 2008 Ackland paper and their discussion, when they compare and contrast the results, they state, at present only one study, Kukle et al. 1997, has reported muscle moment arms in coronal plane abduction and forward flexion. A significant limitation of that study was that all muscles except the deltoid were approximated by one effective muscle line of action. It has been shown that multi-pennate muscles represented by single lines of action are unlikely to yield accurate estimates of muscle moment arms and joint torques, citing Vanderhelm and Venbas 1991, a truly barn burner of a paper if you want to go read it. I did. We found the direction of a muscle's line of action had a significant influence on measurement of tendon excursion and therefore the muscle's moment arm. Kukle et al. Finish this limitation by stating, in future studies, possibly more lines can be affixed to each muscle, the different components measured and compared. Which is exactly what the Ackland paper did in 2008, taking into account 3 different portions of the muscle and getting segment-specific lever arms. Although, again, let's recall the limitations of their paper, estimated center of rotation, not taking into account internal, external rotation at the shoulder, estimations of muscle lines of pull based on standard anatomy, which may or may not, which is ignoring individual specifics. So, the Kukle paper found significantly different results. Unfortunately, it didn't measure above 80 degrees of flexion, although I think looking at that data, we can agree that it wouldn't have dropped to zero. It would have been significantly higher. But with the severe limitation of using a single line of pull that would not appear to represent the individual segments of the lats, which do have differing lines of pull. But that said, we do know that muscle groups don't really fire in isolation, right? It's not like when you're doing a lat type movement that only one section is firing. That's not how muscles work, right? We know that in the pecs, even if you're doing like a heavy flat bench, the costal portion, the upper pecs are still firing, right? Even when there's slightly different lines of pull, it's not like a muscle it's not like only the superior portion of the lats fires. So we might counter argue that using a centroid lever arm, the resultant force from the lats in the real world might be more accurate. Now, that's not saying you can't get slightly preferential effects. In fact, I've said for years that probably for optimal lat development, you do need different movements. You need one that's going to be targeted a little bit more, the superior fibers, which are a little more horizontal, but it's not as if a given lat movement was only targeting that portion. It's a matter of slightly preferential stresses. And in the real world, what have bodybuilders always done? Multiple lat movements, one for upper lats, middle lats, used to be rows for thickness, pull downs for width. I mean, we knew this. And I'd point out again that my back workout for years was narrow grip, cable rows, shrug backs for mid back purely, wasn't a lat movement, some sort of wider grip pull down depending on what I had access to, and a pullover. So we're not reinventing the wheel. My point is simply that the lats don't fire in complete isolation based on movement. They fire as a whole, so maybe the resultant vector is the more accurate lever arm. Maybe it's not. I'm not saying that that's true. I'm saying that in the real world of how muscles work, perhaps using the resultant lever arm is more accurate, which gives completely different results. So I'm not saying it is or it isn't, just another consideration. Let's wrap it up. Social media has decided in absolute terms that the lats have no leverage above 120 degrees of flexion. And I guess, therefore, that above that point, it's just the movement's being taken over by the pecs and other muscles to start humeral extension, which, again, we know that the pec has always been a weak shoulder extensor. We know that other muscles are involved. No one has ever, ever, ever fucking said that you can get 100% isolation of a muscle. But like so many things, once it's been sort of introduced to social media, it's starting to be repeated by various groups. And then, of course, it'll sort of become true by repetition without anybody considering nuance, like the fasted cardio thing I've talked about and so many other things. Chris Beardsley wrote a more nuanced article. And honestly, the lift run bang guy should be arguing with him, because Chris even says that above 120, the inferior lats have an admittedly small moment arm. Being me, I looked at the details of the two papers on the topic. Ackland has the most thorough data in that it represented all three sections, but had severe limitations in terms of applying it uncritically to real-world exercise. Repeating myself, they estimated the center of rotation, which can drastically impact lever arms, or will impact the lever arm calculation. They estimated lines of pull, which also affects the calculation. They didn't take into account real-world internal and external rotation and glenohumeral translation of the shoulder, all variables and factors that actually occur in real-world movement outside of mounting a bloody stump to a metal piece and moving it manually through a bunch of different motions. The data is valuable, but you cannot uncritically apply it without looking at these other factors, or even reading the discussion to see the limitations of the paper brought up by the researchers. It's also only one paper. Science rests on replication. And maybe when they replicate this data, with hopefully similar, better methodology, it will support it and validate it. And hopefully they'll take into account some of these other important factors. And at that point, we can have this discussion again. But even here, there's a second paper by Kukli et al. That found completely different results, although it had its own limitations. It only went to 80 degrees of shoulder flexion. And I think well, looking at that graph and the slopes, they were nearly identical, just with different absolute numbers. It wouldn't have gone to 0, but it would have been much higher. But they were severely limited by using a single point on the muscle to estimate the lever arm. So it was a significantly weaker methodology. And as I mentioned as a counter-argument, the lats don't fire in complete isolation on the different segments. Maybe using a single lever arm from the center of the entire lat is more accurate. I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I'm saying in the real world, you don't see individual sections of any muscle firing like this. At most, you see proportional stress based on fiber direction and lever arms and line of pull of the exercise. Maybe theirs is the more accurate paper. Maybe it's not. Regardless of that, you still have to consider both papers on the topic. The Hick and Hull paper that Chris Beardsley cited considered both of them, presented both of their data, and he only discussed one set. Admittedly, he used a hell of a lot more nuance than everybody else right now, even if he seems to have skirted some of the limitations of the Ackland study and ultimately drawn no conclusions about real-world training that are new or even particularly interesting to me. But at least he addressed nuance, which is the problem with social media. When you're doing a 1-minute video to drive folks to your members area, you can't address nuance. You speak in absolutes. When you're doing trite Instagram memes for people with an attention span of 5 seconds, you can't address nuances. Chris at least acknowledged that the inferior portion of the lats did have a lever arm, Lift, Run, Bang, and N1 should be arguing with him because he disagrees with their absolute conclusions, or at least as I've seen them. If the N1 guys are saying something more nuanced, I don't know, and I'm sorry if I'm misrepresenting that. So my big take home, there's one study with severe limitations to real-world exercise that people are taking in absolute terms, that they also seem to be taking as the final word on the topic, despite only being one paper, and uncritically applying to real-world exercise. To put that cordially, it's asinine. And to put it less than cordially, it's ignorant as fuck. But let's face it, the online fitness industry runs on ignorant as fuck. See y'all next time.